Hello everyone, I am Evely, and today I'm going to tell you a story. Enjoy your viewing. The lab was built deep underground, hidden beneath layers of reinforced concrete and steel, its existence known only to those who had dedicated their lives to the pursuit of human perfection. The project was originally conceived as a dream, a way to create a race of beings who would be immune to disease, free from the shackles of aging, and unparalleled in intelligence, strength, and beauty. The kind of beings that could transcend the limitations of ordinary humanity. At first, it seemed like a noble endeavor. The world's brightest minds were drawn to the cause, eager to perfect what nature had failed to do. But as the years wore on, the dream began to darken. In the silence of the lab, where the scent of sterile chemicals mingled with the metallic tang of machines, the first whispers of something terrible began to emerge. It began with a few subtle anomalies, flashes of aggression, disturbing behavioral shifts, and intense feelings of superiority. But no one took them seriously. After all, these were just test subjects, people who had volunteered for something greater than themselves, something that would ensure the future of humanity. The first successful experiment came in the form of a young man named Jonah. He had been part of a group of volunteers for the program, chosen because of his genetic predisposition toward exceptional intelligence. Jonah had lived his life in the shadow of his parents' expectations, always struggling to meet their unattainable ideals. But in the lab, he was given a new chance, a chance to be something more, something beyond human. The transformation was swift. Jonah underwent a series of injections, serums designed to enhance his cognitive abilities, to expand the very framework of his mind. He was the first, the guinea pig of this new breed. His neural pathways were altered, restructured, and reinforced, as though his brain were being rebuilt piece by piece. When the tests were complete, Jonah's brain was twice as powerful as any human's. He could remember everything he'd ever read or seen with perfect clarity. His intellect was boundless, and his senses were heightened to a degree that would have driven a normal person mad. For a while, he was the picture of human achievement. But soon, cracks began to form in Jonah's new consciousness. His sense of self began to fragment. What once had been a humble young man, eager to impress, now became something far darker. Jonah's once submissive personality began to shift. He grew impatient, angry, and increasingly volatile. He could no longer tolerate the presence of others in the lab, those who worked beside him. Their dull, primitive minds, as he called them, were now a source of irritation, a constant reminder of the base humanity from which he had risen. He began to lash out, first with words, then with actions. One evening, as the lab staff gathered around a large table to discuss the progress of the project, Jonah stood at the far side of the room, his eyes cold and calculating. His once shining intellect was now clouded by something darker, a simmering hatred for everything and everyone around him. Without warning, he grabbed a scalpel from the table and lunged at Dr. Pierce, the lead researcher. The sharp blade cut across the doctor's neck, and in that moment, the room fell into chaos. Screams filled the air as Jonah, no longer the bright young man who had entered the lab, became a violent creature with no regard for human life. His fellow volunteers tried to restrain him, but they were no match for the strength and precision of Jonah's enhanced abilities. He moved with terrifying speed, a predator toying with its prey. It wasn't long before the lab became a blood-soaked battlefield. Scientists and volunteers alike were killed or maimed in the ensuing carnage. Jonah's rage was unstoppable. Every time someone attempted to reason with him, he would strike them down without hesitation. Dr. Pierce had been one of the first to realize the truth. The human mind, when pushed too far, could not simply evolve without consequence. And so, in the wake of the attack, the project leaders were forced to reckon with the horrifying reality. The enhancements, designed to bring about perfection, had inadvertently unlocked a monstrous side of humanity. Aggression, violence, and hatred had been bubbling beneath the surface, ready to explode. Jonah was eventually subdued, though it took several hours of intense sedation to calm him. He was locked away in a cell under heavy surveillance. But the damage had been done. The project, which had once seemed so promising, was now teetering on the brink of disaster. Dr. Pierce and the other lead scientists quickly realized that their so-called perfect race was not only far from perfect, it was a nightmare waiting to unfold. Despite the horrors of Jonah's outburst, the project pressed on. They could not afford to abandon their work. They would refine the process, they thought. They would adjust the formulas, alter the neural modifications, and take more precautions. But each new test subject seemed to fall deeper into the abyss. They were like Jonah, creatures of brilliance, but with minds twisted by their newfound superiority. They began to see themselves as gods, looking down on the rest of humanity with disdain. It wasn't long before something even worse than rage began to take shape. The newly enhanced individuals, driven by a primal sense of isolation, began to withdraw from the world. They didn't trust each other, even as they were united by their shared abilities. If anything, their hatred for one another grew, fueling an environment of suspicion and violence. The lab became a powder keg, where even the slightest spark could ignite a deadly chain reaction. The first death within their ranks occurred when one of the enhanced individuals, a woman named Elena, became convinced that her fellow test subjects were conspiring against her. Her intelligence had become so vast, her mind so sharp, that she could find threats everywhere, even where there were none. Elena turned against her colleagues, setting off a violent chain of events. The lab's once sterile hallways became stained with blood, as betrayal and mistrust spread like wildfire. By now, the scientists had realized that the formula they had created was a dangerous one. The genetic enhancements had triggered something far darker than they had anticipated. It wasn't just aggression or violence. It was a deep-rooted need to dominate, to be the supreme being in a world full of lesser creatures. And what's worse, the enhanced humans began to realize that their perfection came with an unimaginable price: their humanity. The once beautiful experiment had spiraled out of control, with each new subject becoming a mirror of the other. More powerful, more intelligent, but more unstable, more brutal. As tensions rose, something even darker began to emerge. A new breed of violence that no one had expected. Jonah's original outburst was only the beginning. The facility was descending into chaos, its once sterile walls now echoing with the sounds of madness. The enhanced individuals, Jonah, Elena, and the others, had become monsters of a new kind, more alien than human. They had transcended the bounds of normalcy, but at what cost? They were brilliant, yes, but their brilliance was tainted by an insatiable desire for dominance and an inability to trust anyone, even those who were like them. The scientists who remained in the facility were becoming increasingly desperate. They had tried to study the phenomenon, to understand why their creations were turning on each other, but the answers were elusive. Every time they attempted to intervene, the enhanced subjects fought back with a ferocity that was impossible to predict. It was clear now, these were no longer humans. They were something else, something terrible. Dr. Pierce, haunted by the death of his colleagues and the failure of the experiment, began to question whether they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The question plagued him as he wandered the dimly lit hallways of the underground lab. Had they created a race that would ultimately destroy itself? And if so, what did that mean for the future of humanity? Were they doomed to repeat the same cycle forever? Forever chasing an impossible ideal of perfection, only to be destroyed by it? It was in one of those long, sleepless nights that the worst possible event occurred. Jonah, Elena, and the others, driven by their paranoia and violence, came together to form an unholy alliance. They had realized that their true power lay in their collective strength. Alone, they were unstoppable. Together, they were gods. They staged a brutal coup against the remaining staff, systematically hunting down and eliminating anyone who still clung to the hope of stopping the experiment. Dr. Pierce, the last of the original team, had barely escaped with his life. He had seen enough, too much, in fact. The facility was no longer a place of science. It had become a prison, and the creatures he had helped create were its rulers. In the silence of the lab, the enhanced humans turned on each other. Jonah, once the leader, had begun to see himself as something greater than the others. He no longer saw Elena as an ally, but as a threat to his godhood. A confrontation between the two was inevitable. Their minds, sharp and twisted by their enhancements, could no longer function together. Each saw the other as weak, inferior. Their final showdown was swift and brutal. Jonah, in a fit of rage, overwhelmed Elena, ripping her apart with an inhuman strength. The lab walls were once again splattered with blood, as the false gods tore each other apart in their pursuit of supremacy. But as Jonah stood over Elena's broken body, something in his eyes changed. The rage faded, and in its place was an emptiness, a deep void. He stared down at his hands, the hands that had once been so full of promise, now soaked in the blood of his fallen comrades. It was then that he realized the true horror. They had created nothing. Their quest for perfection had only led them to destruction. Yet Jonah was not the only one to experience this revelation. The remaining enhanced individuals, having witnessed the carnage and betrayal, began to question their own purpose. They too felt the void that Jonah had discovered. In a twisted sense, they were all searching for something they could never find. A sense of fulfillment that lay beyond their intellect, beyond their strength. They had been gifted with everything they could ever need, yet they were left with nothing. As the lab descended into total disarray, Dr. Pierce made a last-ditch attempt to contain the disaster. Armed with the knowledge of the original formula, he ventured deep into the heart of the facility, where the central control systems for the experiments were housed. His plan was simple. He would shut down the facility, cut the power, and trigger a full lockdown. It was a drastic measure, but it was the only way to ensure the enhanced humans could not escape and unleash their terror on the world beyond. As he approached the control room, he heard something. Scraping footsteps, faint but unmistakable. His heart raced as he realized that he was not alone. He turned to face the source of the sound, only to find Jonah standing at the far end of the corridor. His eyes cold and empty, as if he had already lost everything. "You can't stop it," Jonah's voice echoed, hollow and unnatural. "You can't stop us. We are beyond your control. We are the future." Dr. Pierce's breath caught in his throat. He had always known this moment was coming, but he had never imagined it would be like this. Standing face to face with the monster his dream had created. Jonah's gaze never wavered as he slowly approached, each step deliberate, each movement calculated. "I'm sorry," Dr. Pierce whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry for everything." But Jonah said nothing. He didn't need to. With a single swift motion, he grabbed Dr. Pierce by the throat, lifting him off the ground. The scientist's feet kicked uselessly in the air as Jonah's grip tightened, his once human face now a mask of fury. There was no mercy in Jonah's eyes, only the cold, unfeeling gaze of something that had outgrown its creators. With a final, suffocating twist, Dr. Pierce's life was snuffed out, and Jonah let his body fall to the floor. The facility was silent for a long moment, the only sound the distant hum of the dying machinery. And then, as if on cue, the rest of the enhanced humans began to gather, drawn to the central hub of the lab. They had all come to the same realization. There was nothing left for them here. Their minds, once sharp and brilliant, now buzzed with a frantic energy, an energy that could no longer be contained by the confines of the lab. They had transcended humanity, and in doing so they had destroyed it. Jonah looked at the others, his expression unreadable. He raised a hand, and with it the others followed. They were not a race of perfection anymore. They were something else, something beyond the scope of human understanding. They were gods of their own making, and they would destroy the world, just as they had destroyed each other. See you in the next video. Don't forget to support me.